for this lecture series. Today we have Nick Bacon presenting. He's going to talk to us about Hartford and stuff that he's found out about Hartford. So, let's give him a round of applause.
Well, my name is Nick Bacon. I graduated here last year, and my senior thesis is this. It was called Lost Valley, Critical Introduction to Urban Space.
Nick, excuse me, you're either going to have to talk loud,
Oh, yeah.
thank you, or we have to turn that on. Yeah, okay, thank you.
So this was my senior thesis called Lost Valley, Critical Introduction to Urban Space here at Hartford, 1633 to 2010. So it covers about 400 years, and it was about 150 pages long. So we're obviously not going to do the whole thesis here in the same sense. But now I'm going to try to leave some time for questions too. I think the spatial representation, I think, will make that better. So just to start with, one of the reasons it's sort of tough to do something on Hartford is because it's kind of hard to say what Hartford is. We typically see sort of work on Hartford done by the municipality level, but the metropolitan region is so much larger. Here I'm going to show how difficult it can be to really show that because of how many different regional boundaries we have. So the more popular ones would be that sort of big dark line, statistical area. That's what I'm using. As well, a lot of the policy decisions that are actually made regionally is that blue dotted line. That's the CUGS region. So it can be tough, especially when you have all this data sort of there and sort of saying the Hartford region and you don't really know what it is. I will be using the MSA throughout this, but it also gets difficult because the region really does change over time. What I have here is this is a diagram made by an urban theorist named Edward Soja. He's a Marxist theorist who's sort of well known in what's called the Los Angeles School of Urbanism. And I would actually say this is a pretty good diagram to sort of show the evolution of urban space in general in the United States, and even in Hartford, although it starts a little late. So we start out with sort of mercantile city. This is after some of the early history that I get into. But in the early Hartford, New York, and Philadelphia, etc., what you really have is a sort of small commercial city and no industry. The industry is outside the city. Around the 1700s and so forth, you would have found sort of mills and factories outside East Hartford, Manchester, Glastonbury. East Hartford, which at that time included Glastonbury, would have actually been the biggest manufacturer of paper during the American Revolution. But you don't really see industry itself go into the city until really the Industrial Revolution. So after about 1820, you start to see sort of industrial capitalism emerge, and the cities change drastically, especially toward the 1840s, when you start to see the trains come in and start connecting New York, places like Hartford to New Haven, and then later to New York, etc. And at this time, you really see not just the emergence of an industrial city, but also the emergence of sort of satellite cities like New Britain and South Manchester, but also the sort of ruralization of the countryside. So we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but sort of the emergence of sort of, instead of subsistence farming outside of the city, all of a sudden you have big corporate tobacco farms, that sort of thing. This sort of continues industrialization until sort of the 1920s, when you start to get a much more sort of regional sort of city under sort of corporate monopoly capitalism, where also you have very, very large industrial satellites created. I would argue around this time you start to see places like East Hartford come about. East Hartford is sort of built overnight as a sort of industrial satellite city around the end of the 1920s as a sort of headquarters for Pratt & Whitney to make airplanes and airplane engines. But what you get toward the end, around now, is sort of big urban mess that's very hard to describe. And oftentimes what you see is a sort of sense of Hartford versus the suburbs. Well, honestly, this is what the Hartford landscape looks like. and I'll have some more specific Hartford maps as we go on. But it's very difficult to describe things that way anymore. So a lot of what my thesis was trying to do was to sort of say, well, what's this really mean? What's this really look like? What's really going on? Is it really a Hartford versus suburb thing, or what? Because I never thought that growing up in East Hartford. So you started out with some immigrants from basically the Boston area who come here because they need land, and it's a very agrarian sort of destination. They're not making Hartford a city. Hartford becomes sort of a political center just because it happens to be between Wethersfield and Windsor, and it's easier to just sort of have all the political meetings in Hartford and to have people from Windsor go down to Wethersfield every year, et cetera, et cetera. But until the late 1700s, really, Hartford is the same size as Wethersfield, and Wethersfield is in many cases actually larger. So Hartford isn't really a city per se until really the end of the 18th century, when you start to see the centralization of the state more often. But what's interesting is that in the beginning, you have these sort of three agrarian towns, and they are, at this time, they have this sort of feudal land system where they have these narrow parcels that make absolutely no sense for farming. So almost instantly, you start to see that the vestiges of feudalism go away. And how that happens is the map on the right, which I don't remember the author's name, it's not right, shows a bunch of the villages that sort of stem out of these sort of central locations. And you start to see the end of sort of a nuclear sort of village very early on, and the emergence of very sort of decentralized agrarian villages with no sort of real perceivable physical order. And some of these become towns in themselves, some of them won't. But they tend to follow the sort of riparian flows, and it's important to note that this is sort of what the landscape is starting to look like well before industrialization. You've got sort of this sort of primordial infrastructure. And also, this is what it starts to get at the end of the 1800s, this sort of municipal government system that still sort of plagues us to this day. All right, so around the 1840s, we started to get industrialization, and I've got at the bottom there a sort of map of railways during the 19th century. It shows how sort of connected it becomes, and all of a sudden you sort of lose the sort of attachment to waterways, sort of factories who depend on river flows, and you get all of a sudden the trains are what decide where everything goes. It's important, in my opinion, to sort of note that it's not just Hartford that becomes industrialized. You're having industrial cities everywhere. At the top there, we've got a map of Rockville in the 19th century, which is out in Vernon. A lot of us wouldn't even think of it today, but all these sort of industrial satellites are created, and they're connected on this sort of transportation grid. So it's not so much that there's one city being created and then one countryside in the Hartford region. There's many tiny little cities created. And once again, it's not just the cities that are red. You sort of see this ruralization based off of the sort of growing monopoly capitalism that starts to come out of this. The Connecticut Valley becomes a sort of center of shade tobacco production. I believe actually even Martin Luther King worked in I think it was East Windsor or one of those towns. Simsbury. So Martin Luther King is in Simsbury as one of the sort of temporary laborers for this sort of thing. I believe he actually spoke well of it for a lot of his life. But the bottom line is that instead of seeing what you're not seeing sort of these rural farms where there's one family sort of growing their own crops. What you're really seeing is sort of this vast increase of cash crop production that's owned by one person and oftentimes done by visitors who are just dorming there over the summer. And I've also included, I've actually pictured a Central Park, which obviously is not in Hartford, but it's made by a person who was from Hartford, Frederick Law Olmsted, who I also believe is buried in the north end of Hartford. Frederick Law Olmsted didn't actually do much in the city of Hartford itself, although it's often rumored that he made places like Bushnell Park and stuff. He didn't. That was Horace Bushnell and some other landscape architects. But Hartford is interesting in that it gets some of the first urban renewal in the form of parks. Bushnell Park is actually made over a neighborhood.